Well, today I have the great honor to introduce our speaker, Fran Ulmer. I met Fran in a very unlikely place, a small island in the middle of the Bering Sea nearly 2 years ago. St. Paul Island is part of the Pribilof Islands and is a highly regarded birding destination. More people probably know it as a filming location for the TV series Deadliest Catch. The birds and wildlife were key reasons for both of us visiting the island that June. Sadly, this island has been the scene of a series of mass seabird die-offs in recent years, likely due in part to climate-driven changes in prey abundance. For me, seeing kind of the aftermath of this, as well as some other experiences I had in Alaska, really struck home how quickly and dramatically ecosystems are changing in northern latitudes. So how has Fran come to be with us today? Her journey started in Wisconsin, which just happens to also be my home state, with Horicon Marsh in her backyard. For those of you that don't know Horicon Marsh, it's the largest freshwater cattail marsh in the United States. She received her undergraduate and law degrees from the University of Wisconsin. She didn't stick around in Wisconsin for very long after that. She moved to Juneau, Alaska, to be lawyer in the Legislative Affairs Agency, which from what I can see, marked the start of a really impressive career in public service. She became the mayor of Juneau, Alaska. She was a state legislator. She was lieutenant governor for Alaska and was candidate for governor in 2002. And I note that, and actually it triggered some trivia in my mind. So today is International Women's Day. So I think it's very appropriate to have someone like Fran joining us on this day. And I was really impressed that she had run for governor, and it made me think about how many other women have been governor in the United States. And at the time that she ran, there had only been 19. Since 1925, the first woman governor was Nellie Ross in Wyoming in 1925. So in 77 years, we had 19. In the approximate 20 years since 2002, we've had 24 women governors. So we're making progress, but clearly we have not reached balance yet. but I'm really impressed with that political career that she has undertaken. She's also has an impressive academic association and career with being professor at the University of Alaska Anchorage. She was a visiting professor at Stanford and at Harvard's Institute of Politics. She became research director of the Institute of Economic and Social Research and was chancellor of the University of Alaska Anchorage. Her accomplishments didn't stop in Alaska. She has had a lot of input into federal policy as well. She was special advisor to the State Department on the Arctic, was chair of the U.S. Arctic Research Commission, is also currently chair of the global board for the Nature Conservancy, and she is currently a senior fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center. She has lectured internationally on Arctic issues from Antarctica to the North Pole, and today she is here with us to present on the topic of rapid Arctic change. Why does it matter, and how can the science community help? Please welcome Fran Ulmer.
Thank you so much, Amber. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me. It is a pleasure. It is an honor. I only wish I was actually at the University of Maine with all of you, which actually we tried to do that last year, but of course COVID inconveniently intervened and didn't make that possible, but perhaps another day in the future. Usually I would be calling in today from Alaska, probably from Anchorage, from the traditional lands of the Dena'ina people, but I'm in California, so today I'm even farther away from the Arctic than most of you. But nonetheless, that is what we're going to talk about today. And in a moment, I'm going to share my screen, or at least I'm going to try to share my screen here. And I would say I am pretty familiar with the fact that actually probably half of this audience knows a fair amount about the Arctic, but I'm going to assume that some people are maybe interested in a little Arctic 101. So I think it is good to start with the fact that the Arctic is an ocean surrounded by land, in contrast to Antarctica, which is just the opposite. And of course, it's usually defined by latitude, but also on summer sun, and it used to be by tree line and temperature, though that doesn't work so well anymore. But the Arctic is a place with some pretty special characteristics. And here are just a few of the things that you might want to think about and that will perhaps make my remarks today fit together a little better. So the 8 countries that are part of the Arctic territory are all, of course, independent nations with different laws, different political systems, with very complicated economic systems, a wide range of things: fishing, mining, oil and gas, tourism, transportation. It's also a place where 4 million people live, and a fairly large percentage of indigenous people of a variety of cultures and languages and traditions. And it is also a place, very importantly, that as a cryosphere, as a cold region, has specialized ecosystems, a whole host of plants and animals that are specifically adapted to what used to be sort of the average Arctic. And I would just say at the outset, the Arctic of the 21st century isn't much like the Arctic of the 20th century. Change is pretty dramatic. So what are some of the things that are changing? We're going to talk about these things: warming temperatures and less sea ice and thawing ecosystems and permafrost and ocean chemistry. So we don't have time to go through the details of all of these, but I do want to talk about them at least a little bit to set in place the explanation as to why there's increasing human activity. So, as Amber said, the warming in the Arctic's really obvious, and it's so obvious in part because of the nature of what the Arctic's all about, but also because it's warming 2 to 3 times global rates of warming. And we're setting all-time highs in a variety of places, in a variety of times of the year, both winter and summer. And when it comes to sea ice, well, since we've been able to see it from satellites and been actually able to visualize it as well as documenting it in the water and on the lands, it's pretty amazing, actually. 50% less in terms of extent of summer minimum sea ice, but also almost 75% less in volume, to the best of our ability to calculate that. So there's a lot less multi-year ice, much more new ice, easier to break up and easier to lose, frankly. And this is perhaps easiest to see when you compare what it sort of looked like in the average around 1980 and what it looks like today in the summer. Again, summer sea ice minimum usually hits in September. When you look at it in a longer time period and see what's happened, we've pretty much dropped off the chart. That's also true for the Greenland ice sheet. As you know, Greenland is the largest island. It's covered largely with ice. The ice sheet is a significant piece of contribution to sea level rise already, and the rate of decline is pretty dramatic. Glaciers all across the north, actually glaciers not only in the north, but in other places as well, are retreating and losing ice, and particularly the tidewater glaciers, which also, like the Greenland ice sheet, are contributing to sea level rise. Permafrost, again, most of you probably know, it's permanently frozen ground, sometimes extremely deep, but it usually has a topsoil layer. Sometimes that's thin, sometimes that's thick, but as we're measuring it literally all across the north, we're seeing increased thawing. In other words, that top layer that used to stay pretty much frozen or just thaw a little bit is thawing deeper to deeper lengths. And that has many consequences, including microbial action, releasing carbon dioxide, and even more dangerously, methane. What really surprised me when I first started studying the Arctic was that almost a quarter of the northern hemisphere is underlain with permafrost. So this is kind of a big deal. Ocean acidification is also becoming more of a big deal. As you may know, about a quarter, almost a quarter, of the excess carbon dioxide that humans have been putting into the atmosphere since, well, at least the last 150 years, about a quarter has been going into the ocean. So that's good news in the sense it's less going into the atmosphere, but it's bad news in the sense that it's changing the chemistry of our oceans. And that has implications, a lot of implications for the ocean and all of the ocean animals. So how do these changes impact the species? Again, we could go into a lot of detail, but again, for purposes of things like the walrus that are very dependent upon ice as a platform for feeding, for resting, for pupping, now have to go on the land as the ice retreats. So this is about 30,000 walrus that have hauled out in northwest Alaska when there wasn't enough ice to rest on. This creates many, many problems for them as well as for humans. But it's not just the walrus. Of course, it's the polar bear and Arctic cod and many seals. But interestingly enough, some are doing okay and some are not. And here are just a couple of examples. The bowhead whale are kind of winners right now for a variety of reasons, but we're seeing increased populations in the Beaufort and the Chukchi. Again, that's largely a function of food. Caribou, no. Caribou at the other end of the spectrum, particularly in winter, they are losing their ability to dig down through the snow and get to the lichens and their food source, because the freeze thaw now of the warming and chilling of the Arctic means that you get layers of ice, which makes it harder for the caribou to dig through. So we've seen mass starvation events as recently as this year. As Amber mentioned, seabirds and shorebirds are struggling actually for a lot of reasons, and not just in the north, but it is largely about food, and it's not completely, but largely about warming oceans. And the warming oceans have also had an impact, particularly in the Pacific blob a few years ago, on Arctic cod. Now, we know a lot of species are moving north and are capable of moving north, but that isn't always true. So it's kind of a mixed bag, and we shall see. Switching to how these changes impact the people of the Arctic. And again, remember, the Arctic is diverse. There isn't just one Arctic or just one Arctic people. There are many different ways of thinking about who lives there, in villages, in cities, in super cold areas where the ice is mostly there, in places like Murmansk and Tromsø, where actually even when it's cold, they have open water, deep water ports. So there's a lot of diversity. But I want to concentrate for a moment on indigenous people that really rely on the land. And by the way, I chose this picture because the sled dog race, the infamous Iditarod sled dog race, is starting this week in Anchorage. So it's kind of on my mind in Alaska anyway. So food security, health, safety, these things actually are really tied to the health and well-being of the species and the ecosystem. So for the indigenous people that rely on fish and wildlife and collecting all kinds of plants and berries, these changes have profound impacts. These are pictures of the Inupiat people in northern Alaska. They rely on bowhead whales as a very important part of both their culture and their food security. That's muktuk in the lower corner of a food delicacy, of course, from the bowhead whale. But as climate has changed and as it has become much more difficult to get to where the bowhead whale are, which tends to be traveling along the ice edge, obviously, as the ice has retreated dramatically during a time when there would normally be hunting, that has made it much more difficult, indeed much more dangerous, for the indigenous to hunt and be able to collect their food. But it's not just in Alaska. I mean, it's in Russia, it's in Sami land, it's where reindeer, as I mentioned before, who have had trouble, both the reindeer and the caribou and other slight subspecies. So these changes are having a big impact right now, not just in the future, but right now on the people who live in the Arctic. Another way in which this is really impacting villages, and I will again just turn to Northwest Alaska, is how much the loss of sea ice is impacting the storm impact of the big waves hitting the coast, particularly in permafrost thawing regions, where there's much more coastal erosion because there isn't the protective blanket layer of ice over the water. So you get these huge pounding waves that really are, in many ways, making it impossible for some communities to stay where they are. Shishmaref, Kivalina, Newtok, these are villages that are in the process of moving because it's too risky to stay where they are. But permafrost thaw and Arctic change doesn't just impact infrastructure in villages. It also impacts places like the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, where there has been considerable change in the thermocoupling and the way in which they are keeping the foundations of the pipeline firm enough, even though permafrost is thawing, so that it doesn't disrupt. This is happening in Russia, of course, as well. Russia has a lot of permafrost, where they're seeing buildings, airports, roads also collapsing because of this kind of permafrost thaw and the change in the Arctic. These have big implications in terms of both risk, but also expense. As was pointed out by a Russian researcher, it's not something it's impossible to deal with through science and planning and engineering, but you've got to put money into it, and you have to admit that there's a problem and be willing to commit. So this old Russian folk saying that he refers to, the peasant won't cross himself until the thunder crashes. You know, it's not just in Russia where this is true, is it? I mean, we can see the changes that lie ahead, whether you live in the Arctic or other places. But are we doing what we need to do to prepare for the changes ahead, the infrastructure changes and many, many other changes that we know are coming? Well, I'll leave that question to you. So how about beyond the region? How about you? How about you in Maine? How about people regardless of where they live? How are these Arctic changes impacting other places? And again, I'll give you a few examples. It's not an exhaustive list and it's brief, but you know, in a way, the Arctic has functioned as an air conditioner for the planet. Loss of the white sea ice and snow cover, which for a long, long time was very helpful in sending back some of the solar power, the radiation back into the atmosphere instead of absorbing it. Now, as we have less snow and ice, more dark surfaces absorb more of that radiation, adding to heat. We call this the albedo. It has this reinforcing of the warmer the ocean, the warmer the land, the more snow and ice melt and the more absorption of heat. So you might think of our air conditioner as losing power, and that has big implications in terms of temperature. A warmer Arctic also has big implications on the jet stream. Less of a temperature differential between the cold north and the warmer mid-latitudes is contributing to a weakening of the jet stream. Instead of it being like a donut that keeps more of the cold air up, it's more like a snake that gives us unpredictable weather. I mean, we've been seeing that lately, right? I mean, just this year, in the last few months, with the polar vortex and the huge problems created in Texas and Mississippi and other places that had to go without power, without water, because of course they had unseasonably cold weather. It has warming impact way beyond the Arctic region. And as you may have seen in the New York Times article, I think it was just last week, about how the contribution of the warming in the Arctic and the contribution of additional cold fresh water from the Greenland ice sheet, et cetera, may be weakening the way in which we have come to assume the circulation patterns of the world's oceans, and particularly the North Atlantic, would contribute perhaps indefinitely to stable climate. Now we're not so sure. So a warming Arctic has global implications. Also in the arena of sea level rise. Obviously, sea level rise, given the fact that so much of the world's population lives along the coast and in very large cities along the coast, having sea level rise in part, contributions from Greenland, from the tidewater glaciers of the north, we can see how that is having implications, again, globally, in a way that makes us all be increasingly aware of and concerned about how much warming is taking place in the Arctic. And we're seeing not just that it's happening, but that the rate of increase is increasing. Just a few slides reminding us of what sea level does. I mean, you know, we can't say for sure how fast this is going to happen, but most of the, I would describe as more conservative estimates about sea level rise, looks like about 1 meter by the end of this century. That's what that would look like for Miami Beach. You know, all the way up to the more extreme versions, not happening this century, but that's what 5 meters looks like. And I might note that the Natural Resources Council of Maine has done projections for 20 of the communities in Maine in terms of what both a 1 meter and 6 meter sea level rise. I think it's worth considering the extent to which, just like the Russian professor observed, are we doing all that we need to do to prepare for what lies ahead? I am not a Maine expert, and talking particularly to an audience where there are Maine professors who probably study this, I want to express my humility and say that, you know, I don't have the answers to the question of how much impact it will have. But I did just a little bit of research to get a sense, because I was curious, the extent to which Maine is susceptible to some of the flooding from the higher tides, and the extent to which the changes that are happening, not just because of warming in the Arctic, but because of all of the ways in which our climate is changing, and the way in which sea level is changing, and the way in which ocean chemistry is changing, might be changing in Maine as well. And as we can see, there are a lot of indicators that even in Maine, which, by the way, considers itself a near Arctic state, I would note that Senator Angus King from Maine is part of the US Senate Arctic Caucus. He has taken a lot of interest in the Arctic, not just because of these kinds of changes, but because of economic opportunities as well, of course. But we are seeing, whether it's in Maine or in California or in Texas or in Alaska, that the changes that are coming, that are already here really, are things that we need to think about as we consider not only how changes in the Arctic, which has, yes, a role in this, but isn't the main cause of what is happening in our planet. So I wanted to also unpack just a little bit, thinking about how this may be impacting humans in Maine. Obviously, your fishing industry has changed. As lobsters have moved north, that's an opportunity. Cod has consistently declined. And your shellfish aquaculture industry, just like those in Victoria and Vancouver and Seattle, are becoming increasingly concerned about how much the ocean acidification changes are going to be impacting that part of your economy. As I think about changes impacting Maine in the future, I see both upsides and downsides. Obviously, the environmental and ecological changes are going to continue, and changes in the fishing industry are going to continue just like they do in Alaska. This is a very dynamic space right now. but it's also an opportunity zone for scientific research. It's also an opportunity for regional economic development, trade, and commerce. And that's what I want to switch to now. The piece of Arctic change, more specifically, that people see as a potential upside. And again, this is like beauty in the eyes of the beholder. For some, it's an upside. For some, it's a risk. For some, it's just a worry. But I think it's worth exploring before we leave the Arctic today, both the economics and the geopolitics of Arctic change. So, as has been observed by many others, it's almost like there's a brand new ocean. I mean, for a very, very long time, the Arctic Ocean was a place that people thought of as cold, dark, distance, don't go there, nothing's happening there. And now, no, now it's more like, gee, maybe there's opportunity for shipping and for natural resource development. And as demand, global population and global demand for resources have grown, interest in the Arctic has also grown as it has become more accessible, as more technology has made it seem more viable as a place to actually do development. All of these things, shipping, fishing, tourism, mining, oil and gas, have been of interest. And that means geopolitical positioning has begun. So let's just explore a couple of those briefly. Commercial fishing in the Arctic. Well, as I said before, the 8 Arctic nations, particularly those with coastlines, 5 of them, have engaged in fishing in the near Arctic in national waters, or even in the Arctic in national waters, but not beyond national waters. In the Central Arctic Ocean, not only has there not been fishing, not only could we say that we couldn't possibly manage a sustainable fishery there because we don't know enough about what's there to do so, but remarkably, the countries of the Arctic came together and negotiated an agreement to not fish in the Central Arctic Ocean, admitting that no one knows enough about what is there. And remarkably and admirably, the EU, China, Japan, and South Korea agreed. So there's a 16-year moratorium, no fishing in the Central Arctic Ocean. And for students, I would just say, I'm sure you've heard about the precautionary approach in conservation. This doesn't happen very often. In other words, protecting an area before you've already ruined it. So that's some good news. Mining in the Arctic is also a topic of considerable interest, particularly in some places. So in Greenland, for example, an area that is reported to have a significant amount of rare earth minerals as well as uranium, there is a lot of interest, particularly in areas that are now more accessible, either being exposed because of the retreat of ice or just because of technology. So there's been, I would say, a bit of a rush, not in a negative way, but Australia, Canada, China, the US have all in one way or another worked with and tried to obtain rights, and there are obtained rights already by Australians and others to move forward in this space. And I might note just this last week, there was another report that came out. There's been quite a few articles written on this topic about a proposal that the countries that already have interests in Greenland, not just Denmark and Greenland itself, but the other countries interested in developing some of the mining there, might come together and band in a way that is constructive to maybe work toward a sustainable way of developing these resources, instead of the way sometimes large-scale mining has done in relatively pristine areas, not in the best possible way. Tourism has been increasing, or at least it was until COVID hit. A lot of interest by people to go to places that other people haven't gone to, or new places, fresh places. And there are beautiful places, Svalbard and many other places in Norway and in Alaska and Canada, Iceland and Greenland have really attracted a lot of attention. And I suspect after COVID, you will see a resurgence of tourism again. Again, the trick here is to do it in a way that is compatible with local cultures and the desires of local people. I might note this travel even extends to the North Pole. I was one of the lecturers on board a trip back in 2017 to the North Pole on a Russian nuclear icebreaker. It was an international group of tourists, many from mainland China, I might note. And I will just share with you, I mean, the good news was it was really interesting being on a nuclear icebreaker, a Russian nuclear icebreaker. But it was a little sad that the day we got to the North Pole, it rained. And even the Russian nuclear icebreaker captain, who had been there many times, was surprised by that. Another indication of how much change is taking place. Shipping. Shipping is another hot topic. If you go to any Arctic conference, you are going to hear about shipping as one of the opportunity zones in the Arctic. And the two routes, the Northern Sea route above Russia, the Northwest Passage above Canada, but also occasionally they would talk about across the top of the Arctic, which will become possible sooner rather than later. Ships are already doing it, but not regularly. You will see this being discussed. Why? Because it's shorter than going through the Suez or the Panama Canal. And so it's largely this reality that, first of all, it's more open than it used to be. And secondly, it's shorter, and time is money in commerce. So that's why there's been more interest, and also because Russia has been promoting it. Russia has promoted it as a way of getting their natural resources out of the Arctic, but also because as a trade area, it gives them opportunity. I mean, every time a ship goes through there, they pay a fee to Russia. The ship has to have a nuclear or an icebreaker escort, which they also have to pay for. So there are economic reasons as well as their own reasons to get natural resources out. I would say there's a lot of hype about shipping in the Arctic, and I would just offer a word of caution. It's still a short season. The ice comes roaring back in winter. We're not talking about an ice-free Arctic year-round. There's very limited infrastructure, which means there's very limited opportunity to respond to any kind of an emergency, to get what you need if something goes wrong. And there is really poor charting in the Arctic. And now in some regions, in the Norwegian region, for example, that's different. But if you look at the Russian and US and Canadian Arctic and large areas that are still relatively pioneering, shall we say. About 2 weeks ago, there was a lot of news coverage of this LNG carrier, an ice-strengthened LNG carrier that was going to make the first ever winter deposit from Yamal down to China. But about 3 days into the journey, they ran into trouble. They lost engine power. Thank goodness they had Russian icebreaker capacity alongside. They still haven't fixed it. And so I included it to say, word of caution here. Where I do think there's more opportunity is in regional shipping. And that regional shipping applies to Maine. Obviously, Portland and places like Halifax on the East Coast with deepwater ports are very attractive to Iceland and Greenland and Norway and Europe as a North American offload point. And so I noticed that Einskip, the Iceland shipping company, has opened up its headquarters there in Portland, Maine. So you see, at the regional level, I think there's a lot of opportunity, and there's certainly a lot of opportunity for even the Russians to get their natural gas off of the north and down to southern latitudes for commerce purposes, but less about transshipment, in my opinion, until some of these things are improved. Instead of just saying it will never happen, I think it may happen, but these are the kinds of things that will have to happen first. In enhanced communication capacity and search and rescue response capacity and navigation aids. These are the kinds of things that need to be invested in if the countries of the North or their partners in the South want to make it viable. And the US needs to take much more seriously its responsibility as one of the Arctic nations with regard to having the necessary infrastructure, whether it's a port in Nome or whether it's replacing our aging icebreakers. We used to sort of have three, two heavies and one medium. We now really only have one heavy, the Polar Star, and even the Healy, our medium icebreaker, is now in port because of some damages to the engine room. So right now we really only have one. Obviously Russia has over more than 40. So we have a little bit of work to do. So let me talk about oil and gas. Oil and gas development in the Arctic may be one of the most controversial. After the USGS came out with this assessment of where the oil and gas is, the price of oil was high at the time, so that made it very attractive. And then countries started debating, is the risk and the revenue, where are the trade-offs? And some countries like Norway said, we're not doing oil development. Yes, we are doing oil development. They've kind of gone back and forth. Canada has said, no, we're not doing it. I would say that, it's largely because there are many challenges of working in the environment that some countries are saying it's not worth the risk. The US has gone back and forth. There was an interest in offshore oil and gas development under Bush, then it got cut back under Obama, then it got reopened under Trump, and now it's being closed down again under Biden. I would say we go back and forth. There's still oil development on land, of course, but it's the offshore that has the higher risk. Not in Russia. In Russia, there is enthusiasm. There's a lot of enthusiasm and there's a lot of support by co-investors like China to make oil and gas development in Russia continue. Why? Because that's where their resources are. A large percentage of Russian oil and gas resources are in the Arctic. And the effort that is being made in places like Yamal are pretty considerable, both in terms of their ability to develop it, but also to transport it to waiting markets. Consistent with that interest is also the interest from the president in terms of making certain that they have the infrastructure they need. And the infrastructure I'm talking about isn't just civilian, it's not just oil development, it's also military. And the military buildup in the north, whether it's new jets that have capability of flying and being parked at 60 below, or whether it's more submarines, whether it's more icebreakers, Russia has been investing and practicing and creating some uncertainty about why. Is it just protecting the Russian motherland and their oil and gas, or developing their shipping, or is there something more? That has created some anxiety, particularly among near Norway, Sweden, Finland, the near neighbors, as they have decided to not only invest more in their own military, reinstate conscription so that they have more assets in both people and in facilities, and in NATO exercises. The US too. The United States has always had an air presence, or at least in the 20th century, for US military in Alaska, but there has also been a considerable increase in the last 15 years, particularly in the last 5 years, recognizing that Arctic policy and defense policy means having a presence. It means having awareness. It means strengthening your ability to operate there if that's necessary. And we have seen many pronouncements under a variety of administrations about why national security in the Arctic is a priority, because it's opening up, because others are going there, because others have been investing there. So it's a relativity concept, but it's also a stewardship concept. I mean, we are an Arctic nation. So we have security interests, we have stewardship interests, and we should always keep in mind that we have cooperation with allies' interest. So recently, the Navy just came out with their new Arctic plan. The Army says that it will release its new Arctic plan shortly. And so we see part of that is normal, and part of that is because there's been so much speculation lately about whether this is a resurgence of great power competition and bringing that great power competition to the Arctic. Many of us hope not, but I would say that when Secretary of State Mike Pompeo made the speech in Finland a couple of years ago, it really got a lot of international attention as signaling possibly more tension than we thought we had in the Arctic space. That was in part, I think, precipitated by China's statements about there being a near Arctic state, about including the Polar Silk Road as part of their new 5-year plan, by the way, which was just released a month ago, that now specifically talks about investing in a Polar Silk Road, which to me means shipping, oil and gas partnerships with the North, mining, et cetera, which again is not surprising. Uh, China is people rich and resource poor, and so it's not surprising that they're looking to the Arctic. So in closing, I want to talk a little bit about international cooperation. I've talked to you about the buildup of the military and the possibility of, seeing people as competition and other countries as competition. Just want to remind us all that really it's been a place of cooperation. The Law of the Sea Treaty sort of lays out how we deal with oceans. The Arctic Council, which has been in existence for 25 years now, with all of the Arctic 8, plus the observing nations, plus the indigenous people of the North, which here are referred to as permanent participants, with a mandate of environmental protection and sustainable development, with a core value of using science to do assessments of the Arctic and make predictions about how to best work together. The agreements that have been negotiated on search and rescue and oil spill response and scientific research, and the one I mentioned about no fishing in the Central Arctic Ocean, even bilaterals like this one between Russia and the United States about the Bering Strait and how to deal with any emergencies there. And really an extraordinary level of cooperation in international science, both in the agreement, in the ministerials that have been held twice and are hopefully still going to be held, both the one that's supposed to be held this spring in Japan, probably virtually, but that Russia plans to hold under its Arctic Council chairmanship. If you want to know about any of these things, I would say go to the website of the US Arctic Research Commission, which for our country is responsible for coming out with every 2 years these statements about what are our priorities for research in the Arctic and how might we best address them collaboratively. Multiple federal agencies, investments by the National Science Foundation, by all the universities that take an interest in the Arctic. And again, the website is arctic.gov. We were planning to meet last year at Maine, at the University of Maine, until COVID intervened, but I know the Research Commission intends to return there when they can. So in closing, scientific research is essential. It's essential to help science-based decision-making. It's essential for the private sector, for the public sector. It's important to the residents of the Arctic, and certainly for all of the agencies that have regulatory authorities about what happens there, whether it's in our country or in other countries. I just want to emphasize that the science and research piece that many of you at the University of Maine are doing is incredibly important. Things like, what do we do to prevent oil spills in the Arctic? Or if it does happen, what do we do to clean up after them? So here's my last slide. I hope today, over the last 45 minutes, I have been able to share enough about these points to make you curious and want to know more about the Arctic, how it's changing, why it's considered both valuable and vulnerable, about the resources of the region and why other countries are interested in it, and why we have an important responsibility to make sure that if there is going to be an expansion of the human footprint through development, through shipping, et cetera, that we use science and research to help guide better decision making, because the new Arctic is going to be quite different. We need to prepare for that, both in the region and globally. The global implications of these Arctic changes are important to all of us, regardless of where we live, whether we live in Alaska or in Maine or anywhere else. So I hope that the students who are on this call today will take up the challenge to not only learn more about it, care more about it, but maybe work in the Arctic to be part of a future of the Arctic that is bright. So with that, Amber, back to you. Thank you very much for letting me join you today.
Thank you, Fran. Wonderful presentation. Kristen Schild with UMaine Arctic is going to help us facilitate Q&A. So please submit your questions in the chat box, and she will go through those. Turn it over to her.
Perfect. Thank you, Amber. So our first question today is actually looking at what are those changes that we will see if we have a change in the Arctic impacted areas, and specifically, could there be another ice age if ocean currents and the jet stream, if they slow or they stop?
Well, let me say at the outset that an atmospheric expert I am not. So my opinion on the answer to that question is not really formed with the kind of scientific background that that question should be answered by. But let me say that we are entering a period where it is far more likely that warming is going to be the challenge of the next few generations than an ice age. Now, we know that the warming that is taking place in our atmosphere affects different areas differently. So warming doesn't necessarily mean warming everywhere. And if in fact the ocean circulation patterns are changing, and if they change precipitously, there certainly could be some areas that are a heck of a lot colder than we've experienced in the past. So there will be regional variations. That is quite clear. And big changes. That is also highly likely. But whether or not we can think of an ice age as being one of those, I would say that's probably in the very unlikely category.
Thank you, Fran. Another question we have concerns politics and how we go about coming up with new laws and new collaborations, and specifically those even within the United States. And given that you were the chair of the U.S. Arctic Research Commission and have worked extensively with people across the entire U.S., this is actually a question that concerns Alaska and Maine relations, given that it's the Northwest and the Northeast hubs of the U.S. Do you envision more collaborations or partnerships between Maine and Alaska in the future? Do you think that this is being considered?
Well, a couple of ways to answer that. First of all, Maine and Alaska do have a lot in common, actually. And it's not just that we're fishing states, and it's not just that we have beautiful rocky coastlines and we have national parks. We have a lot of people who care deeply about the environment. And so I would say there's already a lot that we do share. But at the Arctic meetings that I have attended, like at the Arctic Circle meetings in Iceland, and I've been to every single one, I see more and more Mainers coming. And you've sent delegations already. And so there's been a lot of crosstalk between Alaskans and Maine people interested in the Arctic already. Both your Senator Angus King and my Senator Lisa Murkowski are friends and often appear at these events together. So yes, at that level, I really see an increasing opportunity zone to talk about things. Now, having said that, in terms of the other part of your question, which is legal changes, that's a little more complicated. And it kind of depends on whether you're talking about big, comprehensive Arctic-wide changes or more specific to each region, depending upon what the issues are. That's easier to answer because some of the questions about Maine and frankly, some of the questions about changes in the law in Alaska are much more granular. They're more about fish, right? They're more about what happens when fish move north. What happens when fishing regulation that made sense based on a certain stable ecosystem changes, right? So there's that terrain, so to speak. But in terms of the more global Arctic rules, it's not up to the states. It's not even up to the US in a way. Those things are handled like organizations like the International Maritime Organization, the IMO, that deals with certain restrictions on what kind of equipment and training ships that use the Arctic must have. So those have to be internationally debated and adopted. So there are many levels of your question, but I would say the increasing amount of awareness of not only how much change there is, but how much value opportunity there is, means that there's going to be a lot more dialogue.
Fantastic. And that leads really well into the next question, stepping it down to even a more local level than Alaska and Maine. You've been to a lot of different universities. How are universities doing? How are we working to address these complex challenges in the Arctic? And is there room for improvement, or where is there room for improvement?
Well, many universities, many researchers have decided that the Arctic is worth their time. And so there really has been an explosion of interest. And I'm not just talking about oceanographers. I mean, I'm talking about social scientists. I mean, I'm talking about across the board. Various disciplines have come to the table to offer their expertise and to find opportunities to collaborate in a multidisciplinary way to think about how these changes really have big implications and what makes them so interesting, finding parallels, finding contrasts, and in some cases, offering solutions. So the last part of your question, what could be improved? To the extent that it's an interesting place to study, I would say, thank you. Thank you for coming and thank you for your interest. But as a longtime Alaskan and as someone who cares a lot about the Arctic, my challenge to you all is think about making your research relevant, actionable, able to translate into actual decisions by decision makers. Make it easier for decision makers to understand you and to take what you know, what you are learning in the research community, in the university community, and put it to work.
That is fantastic advice. And so our next question is actually looking at these collaborations. So are there strongly either renewed or new scientific collaborations among countries that are now happening because of this drastic change in the Arctic, and now even the regions that are Arctic impacted are growing?
So I would urge you, when this is over, go Google Mosaic. So Mosaic is a shorthand for an international Arctic science collaboration that ended a couple months ago. And it was historic, to say the least. It had researchers from many, many different countries, many different universities, state and federal agencies, et cetera, all come together on an Yeah, it was. Well, actually, I'm not sure it was an icebreaker. It was a research vessel that was ice strengthened, that I can say, that got frozen into the Arctic over winter. And that allowed these researchers to actually study the Arctic in winter, which is kind of a hard thing to do. Most of the research that has been done hasn't been done in the Arctic, right? So that never would have been possible. Alfred Wegener Institute of Germany led the charge on that, but it had money from Norway and from China and from the US and from many, many different countries to make that collaboration possible. It got uplifted dramatically by the Arctic Science Ministerials 1 and 2 that not only populated the science teams, but really attracted additional funding to make it possible. That's just one example. So go Google Mosaic and you'll get some great photos and stories from the people who are there.